I implore you, do not curse me, my beloved parents, but let a tear of compassion and pardon grace the memory of your lost child. Chapter 23. While Valerie was finding solace in the comforting friendship of Mrs. Henderson, Montraville was quickly developing strong feelings for Miss Patten. Julia was a friendly girl. She only saw the positive side of his character. She had an independent fortune and was determined to be happy with the man she loved, even though his social status and wealth were not as high as she had expected. She noticed the hidden passion that Montraville struggled to conceal. She was surprised by his timidity, but she believed that the difference in their financial situations caused his hesitation, and she made every appropriate effort to advance the relationship with prudence and modesty. Montraville was pleased to see that she cared for him, but his sense of honor prevented him from taking advantage of her affection. He was well aware of Valerie's circumstances, and he believed it would be doubly cruel to abandon her at this time. Marrying Miss Patten while still obligated to protect and support Valerie would be a despicable act that disgusted him. He confided his unease to Belcour, who was secretly pleased by this revelation. "So, you actually hesitate to marry the lovely Julia and become the master of her fortune just because a foolish, infatuated girl chose to leave her family and run away with you to America. Dear Montraville, act more sensibly. This weeping, longing Valerie, who causes you so much distress, would have eloped with someone else if not with you." "I wish to God," said Montraville, "that I had never met her. My feelings for her were merely a fleeting desire, but I know I will love and respect Julia Patten for the rest of my life. However, abandoning poor Valerie in her current situation would be indescribably cruel." "Oh, my dear sentimental friend," said Belcour, "do you think no one else is capable of providing for the brat besides you?" "Of course," he said, "you can't possibly mean to imply that Valerie is being deceitful." "I'm not implying it," said Belcour. "I know it." Montraville turned pale. "Then there's no trust in women," he said. "While I thought you were attached to her," said Belcour with an indifferent tone, "I didn't want to make you uneasy by mentioning her betrayal. But since I know you love and are loved by Miss Patten, I was determined not to let these foolish notions of honor come between you and happiness, or let your affection for a treacherous girl prevent you from uniting with a woman of integrity." "Goodness gracious," said Montraville, "what painful thoughts a man endures when he sees a beautiful woman engulfed in shame and knows that he was the one who seduced her. But are you certain of what you're saying, Belcour?" "To the extent," he replied, "that she herself made advances toward me which I refused out of consideration for you. But forget about her. I had dinner at Patten's today, and Julia asked me to find you and bring you over for tea. So come on, my friend, make good use of this opportunity and seize the gifts of fortune while they're within your grasp." Montraville was too disturbed to have a pleasant evening even in the company of Julia Patten. He decided to visit Valerie early the next morning, confront her about her falsehood, and bid her farewell forever. But when morning came, he was ordered on duty, and for 6 weeks he was unable to carry out his plan. Finally, he found an hour to spare and went out to spend it with Valerie. It was almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon when he arrived at her house. She wasn't in the living room, so without calling the servant, he went upstairs, thinking he would find her in her bedroom. He opened the door, and the first thing he saw was Valerie asleep on the bed, with Belcour beside her. "Oh, my goodness," he said, stomping his foot. "This is too much. Wake up, you scoundrel, and defend yourself." Belcour jumped off the bed. The noise woke Valerie. She was terrified by Montraville's furious appearance and seeing Belcour with him in the room. She grabbed his arm as he stood next to the bed and anxiously asked what was going on. "You deceitful, despicable girl," he said. "Can you even ask? How did he get here?" pointing at Belcour. "I swear to God," she replied, crying, "I don't know. I haven't seen him in 3 weeks." "So you admit he sometimes visits you?" "He came occasionally at your request." "That's a lie. I never asked him to come, and you know it. But listen to me, Valerie. From now on, our relationship is over. Let Belcour or any of your other beloved lovers take care of you. I am done with you forever." He was about to leave her, but she suddenly leaped off the bed, knelt before him, and protested her innocence, begging him not to abandon her. "Oh, Montreville," she said, "kill me, please kill me. But don't doubt my loyalty. Don't leave me in this horrible situation. For the sake of our unborn child, please don't reject the miserable mother." "Valerie," he said firmly, "I will make sure that you and our child lack nothing in the upcoming difficult times, but we will never see each other again." He then tried to lift her off the ground, but in vain. She held on to his knees, begging him to believe her innocence and urging Belcour to reveal the terrible truth. Belcour gave Montreville a disdainful smile. It annoyed him to the point of anger. He pulled away from the weak embrace of the distressed girl. She screamed and collapsed onto the floor. Montreville immediately exited the house and hurriedly went back to the city. Chapter 24. Unfortunately for Valerie, about 3 weeks before this unfortunate encounter, Captain Henderson was ordered to Rhode Island, and his wife had accompanied him. Thus Valerie was deprived of her friendly advice and comforting companionship. The afternoon on which Montreville had visited her, she had felt exhausted, and after having a very light meal, she had laid down to try and regain her energy. Contrary to her expectations, she had fallen asleep. She had not been asleep for long when Belcour arrived, as he took every opportunity to visit her and try to fuel her resentment against Montreville. He asked the servant where her mistress was, and upon being informed that she was asleep, he picked up a book to entertain himself. After sitting for a few minutes, he happened to glance toward the road and saw Montreville approaching. In that instant, he conceived the wicked plan of forever ruining poor Valerie in his eyes. He quietly tiptoed upstairs and cautiously laid himself next to her, fearing she might wake up. It was in this compromising position that his trusting friend discovered him. When Montreville rejected the crying Valerie and left her almost distraught with fear and despair, Belcour helped her up from the floor and, acting as a compassionate and comforting friend, led her downstairs. She listened to the arguments he presented with apparent composure, but this was only a temporary calm. The memory of Montreville's recent cruelty flooded her mind once again. She pushed Belcour away with some force and cried, "Please leave me, sir. I fear that you have caused my faithfulness to be doubted. Go, leave me to the suffering that my own foolishness has brought upon me." She then hurriedly left him and went to her own room, where she threw herself onto the bed and released an indescribable outpouring of grief. Belcour now considered the possibility that Valerie might write to Montreville and try to convince him of her innocence. He knew well of her heartfelt pleas and was aware of Montreville's tender heart. He decided to prevent any letters from reaching him. Belcour called the servant and, through the persuasive power of a bribe, convinced her to promise that any letters her mistress might write would be sent to him. He then left a polite and tender note for Valerie before returning to New York. His first task was to find Montreville and try to persuade him that what had transpired would ultimately lead to his happiness. He discovered him in his room, alone, lost in unpleasant reflections. "What's the matter, my whining, pining lover?" he said, patting him on the shoulder. Montraville started, a momentary flush of resentment appearing on his cheek before quickly being replaced by a deathly pallor. This was caused by painful memories awakened by that inner voice, which, despite our futile attempts, can never be completely silenced. "Belcourt," he said, "you've hurt me in a sensitive spot." "Come on, Jack," Belcourt replied. "Don't take it too seriously. How could I resist the girl's advances? And thank goodness she's not your wife." "True," said Montraville, "but she was innocent when I first met her. It was I who seduced her, Belcourt. If it hadn't been for me, she would still be virtuous and happy, surrounded by her family's love and protection." "Oh, come on," Belcourt laughed. "If you hadn't taken advantage of her trusting nature, someone else would have. What's the difference, really?" "I wish I had never met her," he cried passionately, rising from his seat. "Oh, that cursed French woman," he added vehemently. "If it hadn't been for her, I could have been happy." He paused. "With Julia Patton," said Belcourt. "Stop, stop," Montraville exclaimed, grabbing Belcourt's hand. The name, like a sudden jolt of electricity, seemed to momentarily freeze him in place. "I beg you, don't mention the lovely Julia and the miserable Montraville in the same breath. I am a seducer, a despicable, ungenerous seducer of unsuspecting innocence. I dare not hope that someone as pure as her would lower herself to join forces with calculated, black guilt. But I swear on everything holy, Belcourt, I thought I loved the lost, abandoned Valerie until I saw Julia. I thought I could never abandon her, but the heart is deceitful, and now I can clearly distinguish between the impulsive passion of youth and the genuine flame of selfless affection." Just then, Julia Patton passed by the window, leaning on her uncle's arm. She curtsied as she went by and, with a charming smile of modest cheerfulness, said, "Are you two hiding indoors on such a beautiful evening, gentlemen?" There was something about her voice, her demeanor, and her gaze that was simply irresistible. "Maybe she wants to be with me," thought Montraville to himself as he grabbed his hat. "If I believed she loved me, I would admit my mistakes and rely on her kindness to have pity and forgive me." He quickly caught up to her and offered his arm as they strolled along pleasant but less crowded paths. Belcourt pulled Mr. Patton to the side and engaged in a political discussion. They walked faster than the young couple, and somehow Belcourt managed to completely lose sight of them. It was a beautiful evening in early autumn. The fading daylight gently streaked the western sky, while the moon, with its pale and pure glow replacing the vibrant gold and purple, adorned the sky with silver clouds that occasionally partially concealed her lovely face, enhancing her every beauty. The gentle breeze whispered through the trees, which were now starting to shed their leaves. A peaceful silence filled the air. For a content mind, an evening like this would bring serenity and undisturbed pleasure. However, for Montraville, while it calmed the turmoil within him, it also intensified his melancholic thoughts. Julia leaned on his arm, and he tenderly took her hand in his, sighing deeply but remaining silent. Julia felt uneasy, wanting to break the inexplicable silence but unable to do so. She loved Montraville and could see his unhappiness, wanting to know the cause of his distress. Yet her innate modesty, instilled in every woman, prevented her from asking. "I'm not good company, Miss Patton," he finally recollected himself and said, "but something happened today that greatly upset me, and I can't shake off the unpleasant impact it had on my mind." "I'm sorry," she replied, "that you have any reason to feel unsettled. I'm certain that if you were as happy as you deserve to be, and as all your friends wish for you—" She hesitated. "And may I," he replied excitedly, "presume to include the lovely Julia in that group?" "Certainly," she said. "The help you have given me, the knowledge of your value, all combine to make me admire you." "Admire, my beautiful Julia," he said passionately, "is just a weak, unfeeling word. If I dared, if I thought I deserved your attention. But no, I must not. I am not worthy of your notice, Julia. I am miserable and have no hope of being otherwise." "Alas," said Julia, "I feel sorry for you." "Oh, you kind-hearted charmer," he said, "how that sweet word uplifts my sad heart. If only you knew everything, you would pity me, but at the same time, I fear you would despise me." Just then, they were joined once again by Mr. Patten and Belcour. This interrupted an interesting conversation. They found it impossible to talk about trivial matters and silently made their way home. At Mr. Patten's doorstep, Montraville once again held Julia's hand and softly said, "Good night," before retreating to his lodgings, feeling disheartened and miserable, knowing that he did not deserve the affection that he could clearly see he was being shown. Chapter 25. "Where is our dear Valerie now?" asked Mr. Temple one evening, as the chilly gusts of autumn blew harshly over the moor, and the golden hue of the far-off forest indicated the impending arrival of winter. In vain the cheerful fire blazed in the fireplace. In vain was he surrounded by all the comforts of life. The love for his parents still remained in his heart. And when he thought that perhaps his once beloved child was now suffering from poverty in a distant land, without a friend to comfort her, without the kind look of empathy to uplift her spirits, or the compassionate voice to soothe her wounded heart, when he thought about this, his entire soul melted with tenderness, and while he wiped away the tear of pain from the eye of his patient, resilient Danielle, he struggled to hold back his own sympathetic tears. "Oh, my poor girl," said Mrs. Temple, "how much she must have changed. Otherwise she would have eased our agonizing minds by sending a message to let us know she was alive and hadn't completely forgotten the parents who adored her." "Goodness gracious," said Mr. Temple, rising from his seat. "I, who aspire to be a father, to experience the agonizing pain inflicted on a parent's heart by the ingratitude of a child." Mrs. Temple wept. Her father took her hand. He wanted to say, "Be comforted, my child," but the words remained unspoken. The sorrowful silence that followed was interrupted by a loud knock on the door. In an instant, a servant entered with a letter in his hand. Mrs. Temple accepted it from him. She looked at the address. She recognized the handwriting. "It's Valerie," she exclaimed, eagerly breaking the seal. "She hasn't forgotten us completely." But before she had read half of its contents, a sudden sickness overcame her. She became cold and dizzy, and handing it over to her husband, she cried, "Read it! I can't." Mr. Temple tried to read it out loud, but frequently had to pause to let his tears flow. "My poor misguided child," he said, when he had finished. "Oh, should we not forgive the dear repentant?" said Mrs. Temple. "We must, we will, my love. She is willing to return, and it is our duty to receive her." "Father of mercy," said Mr. Robinson, raising his clasped hands, "let me but live once more to see the dear wanderer restored to her afflicted parents, and take me from this world of sorrow whenever it seems best to your wisdom." "Yes, we will receive her," said Mr. Temple. "We will try to heal her wounded spirit, and speak peace and comfort to her troubled soul. I will write to her to return immediately." "Oh," said Mrs. Temple, "I would, if possible, fly to her, support and encourage the dear sufferer in the approaching time of distress, and tell her how closely penitence is connected to virtue. Can't we go and bring her home, my love?" she continued, placing her hand on his arm. "My father will surely forgive our absence if we go to bring home his beloved." "You cannot go, my Danielle," said her husband. "The delicacy of your body would not handle the fatigue of a long journey well. But I will go and bring the gentle penitent to your arms. We may still have many years of happiness." The struggle in the heart of Mrs. Temple between maternal and marital tenderness was long and painful. Eventually, the former won, and she agreed that her husband should set off to New York as soon as possible. She wrote to her Valerie in the most tender, comforting way, and looked forward to the joyful moment when she would embrace her again with the most hopeful anticipation. Chapter 26. In the meantime, the infatuation Montreville had developed for Julia Patten grew stronger every day, and he clearly saw how much that lovely girl loved him. He was also strongly convinced of Valerie's betrayal. What a marvel it is, then, if he surrendered himself to the delightful sensation that filled his heart, and encountering no obstacles to hinder his happiness, he asked it for and received the hand of Julia. Just a few days before his wedding, he spoke to Belcourt in the following manner: "Even though Valerie, with her disgraceful behavior, has distanced herself from my protection, I still feel obligated to support her until she is no longer in her current state, and also to provide for the child. I have no intention of seeing her again, but I will entrust you with a sum of money that will more than sufficiently provide for her every need. However, if she requires more, let her have it, and I will ensure it is repaid. I truly wish I could persuade the poor misguided girl to return to her family. As an only child, there is no doubt in my mind that they would gladly welcome her back. It would greatly distress me to witness her living a life of disgrace from this point forward, as I would always blame myself for being the primary cause of all her mistakes. If she chooses to remain under your care, please be kind to her, Belcourt, I implore you. Do not let weariness drive you to treat her in a way that might push her towards actions that necessity might compel her to, while her better judgment disapproves of them. She shall never be without a friend as long as I am alive, but I no longer have any desire to see her. Her presence would always be painful to me, and a single glance from her would bring a blush of guilt to my face. I will send her a letter, which you can deliver once I have left, as I will be heading to St. Eustatia the day after my marriage to Julia, who will be accompanying me." Belcourt assured his friend that he would fulfill this request, although he had no intention of actually delivering the letter or informing Valerie about the provision Montreville had made for her. His true aim was to completely ruin the unfortunate girl, believing that by making her entirely dependent on him, he could gradually convince her to satisfy his selfish desires. On the evening before Montreville and Julia's wedding, Montreville retired to his room early. Reflecting on the past events of his life, he felt intense remorse when he recalled Valerie's seduction. "Poor girl," he said to himself, "I will at least write to bid her farewell. I will also try to reawaken the sense of virtue in her heart that her unfortunate attachment to me has extinguished." He picked up the pen and began to write, but the words eluded him. How could he address the woman he had seduced, the woman whom he deemed unworthy of his affection, and inform her that he was about to abandon her forever? How could he confess that he was about to renounce her, enter into an unbreakable bond with another, and not even acknowledge the child she bore as his own? He started and discarded several letters before finally completing the following. To Charlotte. Although I struggle to find the words to address you, my dear victim, I cannot bear to leave you without bidding you farewell through this letter. I want you to know how much my heart aches when I remember the person you used to be before you encountered the detested Montreville. Even now, my imagination conjures the scene, when, torn by conflicting emotions, when, torn between love and duty, you fainted in my arms, and I lifted you into the carriage. I see the anguish in your mind, when, regaining consciousness, you realized you were on the road to Portsmouth. But how, my dear girl, how could you, when you were so rightly impressed with the value of virtue, how could you, when I believed you loved me, succumb to Belcour's persuasions? Oh, Valerie, my conscience tells me that it was I, the villain that I am, who first introduced you to the temptations of sinful pleasure. It was I who pulled you away from the peaceful rest that innocence and virtue always enjoy. And dare I tell you, that it was not love that drove me to commit this terrible act? No, my dear fallen angel, believe your repentant Montreville when he tells you that a man who truly loves will never betray the person he cares for. Farewell, Valerie. If you can still find happiness in a life of blameless innocence, return to your parents. You will never lack the means to support both yourself and your child. Oh, merciful heaven! May that child be completely free from the faults of its father and the frailties of its mother. Tomorrow, but no, I cannot tell you what tomorrow will bring. Belcour will inform you. He also has money for you, which I ask you to request whenever you may need it. Farewell once more. Believe me, if I were to hear that you had returned to your loved ones, and were enjoying the peace that I have stolen from you, I would be as happy as even you, in your fondest moments, could wish me, but until then, a shadow will darken the brightest prospects of Montreville. After he had sealed this letter, he threw himself onto the bed and enjoyed a few hours of rest. Early in the morning, Belcour knocked on his door. He got up quickly and prepared to meet his Julia at the altar. "This here is the letter for Valerie," he said, handing it to Belcour. "Take it to her when we head off to Eustatia. And I beg you, my dear friend, don't try any tricky arguments to stop her from returning to goodness. But if she leans in that direction, support her in the idea and help her carry out her plan." Chapter 27. Charlotte had now been left for almost 3 months to her own sad and reflective thoughts, a lonely existence indeed. No one intruded upon her solitude except for Belcour, who called a couple of times to check on her well-being and inform her of his futile attempts to reason with Montreville. Only once did her spirits lift when she received a loving letter from Mrs. Henderson. She had often written to her treacherous seducer, employing the most persuasive language to prove her innocence. However, these letters never reached Montreville's hands. If they had, they would have prevented him from abandoning the wretched girl, even on the brink of their marriage. The genuine anguish in her heart had greatly diminished her beauty. Her cheeks were pale due to lack of sleep, and her eyes, exhausted from constant weeping, were sunken and heavy. Occasionally, a glimmer of hope danced in her heart when she thought of her parents. "Surely," she would say, "they won't refuse to forgive me, and even if they deny me their pardon, they won't hate my innocent child because of its mother's mistakes." How often did the grieving Charlotte long for the comforting presence of the kind-hearted Mrs. Henderson. "If she were here," she would exclaim, "she would certainly console me and ease the torment of my soul." One afternoon, as she was lost in these melancholic thoughts, Belcour entered and interrupted her. As much as her appearance had been altered by constant sorrow, she remained captivating and still held an allure. The unholy desire that drove Belcour to create discord between her and Montreville still burned within him. He was determined to make her his lover if possible. He had even concocted a wicked plan to bring her to New York and showcase her in every public setting where she was likely to encounter Montraville, so that he could witness his unmanly triumph. When he entered the room where Valerie was seated, he put on a facade of tender and consoling friendship. "And how is my lovely Valerie?" he asked, taking her hand. "I fear you are not as well as I would hope." "I am not well, Mr. Belcourt," she replied, "very far from it. But the physical pains and weaknesses I could bear and even endure with patience if they were not exacerbated by the unbearable anguish of my mind." "You are not happy, Valerie," he said, pretending to be sorrowful. "Alas," she responded mournfully, shaking her head. "How can I be happy, abandoned and forsaken as I am, without a female friend to whom I can confide my burdensome heart? Furthermore, my loyalty is doubted by the very man for whom I have sacrificed everything valuable in life, for whom I have reduced myself to a pitiful and scorned creature, an outcast from society, merely an object of contempt and pity. You underestimate yourself, Miss Temple. No one would dare to treat you with contempt. Those who have the pleasure of knowing you must admire and respect you. You are lonely here, my dear girl. Allow me to take you to New York, where the enjoyable company of some ladies, whom I will introduce you to, will dispel these sad thoughts, and I will once again see happiness return to your lovely face." "Oh, never, never!" cried Valerie, emphatically. "The virtuous women will scorn me, and I will never associate with disgrace. No, Belcourt, let me hide my shame and sorrow here. Let me spend my remaining days in obscurity, unknown and unpitied. Let me die unlamented, and let my name be forgotten." Her tears prevented her from speaking further. Belcourt was silenced and did not dare to interrupt her. After a moment of silence, she continued, "I once thought of going to New York to find the still beloved, though cruel and ungenerous, Montraville, to throw myself at his feet and beg for his mercy. Heaven knows, not for myself. If I am no longer loved, I won't rely on his pity to heal my wounds, but I would have knelt and begged him not to abandon my unborn child." She couldn't say more. Her cheeks turned red, and she covered her face with her hands, sobbing aloud. Belcourt's heart was touched by her emotional speech, and he walked towards the window. However, his selfish desires soon overpowered these sympathetic feelings, and he believed that if Valerie realized she no longer relied on Montraville, she would more readily seek his protection. Therefore, determined to inform her of everything that had happened, he sat back down and, seeing her becoming more composed, asked if she had heard from Montraville since the unfortunate encounter in her bedroom. "Ah, no," she replied. "I'm afraid I'll never hear from him again." "I completely agree with you," said Belcourt, "because he has recently been deeply attached." At the mention of attached, Valerie's face turned pale, but she reached for some smelling salts that were nearby, and Belcourt continued. "He has recently been deeply attached to a Miss Patton, a charming and vivacious girl with a large fortune." "She may be wealthier, may be more attractive," cried Valerie, "but she cannot love him as much as I do. Oh, may she be cautious of his deceit and not trust him as much as I have." "He publicly courts her," he said, "and there were rumors that they were to be married before he sailed for Eustatia, where his company has been sent." "Belcourt," Valerie said, grabbing his hand and staring at him intently, her trembling lips showing her anguish. "Tell me, and tell me honestly, do you think he could be so heartless as to marry another woman and leave me to die in a foreign land without any means or happiness? Tell me what you think. I can handle it. I won't shy away from this severe blow of fate. I deserve my suffering, and I will try to bear it as I should." "I'm afraid," said Belcourt, "that he could indeed be that heartless." Perhaps, she cried, eagerly interrupting him. Perhaps he is already married. Come, let me know the worst, she continued with a feigned look of composure. You don't have to worry. I won't send the fortunate lady a bowl of poison. Well then, my dear girl, he said, deceived by her appearance. They got married on Thursday, and yesterday morning they sailed for Eustatia. Married and gone, you say, she cried in a distraught tone. Without a final farewell, without a single thought for my wretched situation. Oh, Montraville, may God forgive your treachery. She screamed, and Belcour rushed forward just in time to catch her before she collapsed to the floor. Disturbing collapses now occurred one after another, and she was taken to her bed, where she fervently prayed she would never rise again. Belcour stayed with her that night, and in the morning found her in a high fever. The episodes she had experienced had greatly frightened him, and now that she was confined to a sick bed, she was no longer an object of desire. It is true that for several days he continued to visit her, but her pale, emaciated appearance disgusted him. His visits became less frequent. He forgot the solemn duty entrusted to him by Montraville. He even forgot the money entrusted to his care, and, as I write it, the burning blush of indignation and shame colours my cheek. His disgrace to humanity and manhood eventually forgot Valerie, who had been wronged by him and, attracted by the robust health of a farmer's daughter whom he had seen during his frequent trips to the countryside, he abandoned the unhappy girl to fade away unnoticed, consumed by sickness, grief, and poverty, while he, having conquered the virtue of the innocent village dweller, indulged in all the excesses of luxury and unlawful pleasure. Chapter 28. Oh my goodness, exclaims my young, passionate reader. I'll never have the patience to get through these books. There are so many expressions of surprise and distress, so much fainting, tears, and sadness. I am so tired of this subject. My dear, cheerful, naive girl, for I assume you to be naive, or else you would deeply understand Valerie's sorrows. I could have been in her shoes if Providence hadn't intervened to save me from destruction. So, my lively, innocent girl, I kindly ask for your patience. I am writing a story of truth, intending to touch your heart. However, if the heart has become hardened by boundless prosperity or a continued life of vice, I don't expect my story to please you. I anticipate it will be met with disgust. But wait, gentle young lady, I beg you not to put it aside until you have read it in its entirety. Perhaps you may find something within that will make it worthwhile. I can almost see a sarcastic smile on your face. And what, you cry, does the arrogant author think we can learn from these pages? If Valerie is presented as a terrifying figure to prevent us from making guilty mistakes, doesn't LaRue triumph in her shame? By using cunning and deceit, she wins the love of a respectable man and ascends to a position where she is respected and accepted in all circles. So, what is the moral you want to convey? Do you want us to believe that deviating from virtue, as long as it's covered up with artifice and hypocrisy, is not detestable? On the contrary, will it bring us fame and honor? Meanwhile, the unfortunate girl who falls victim to her own sensitivity will be burdened with disgrace and shame. No, my curious questioner, I don't mean any of that. Remember that the schemes of the wicked are often allowed to succeed, so that their downfall may be all the more bitter in the end. The cup of suffering is poured out for wise and beneficial reasons, and those who are forced to drink it to the very last drop often find solace at the lowest point.